Installing new aftermarket speakers is more than just connecting the wiring and bolting the new speaker in. To get the most out of our new speakers, we need to use proper installation techniques. What materials should we be applying to the speaker adapter, and why am I repinning this aftermarket wire harness? I'm currently working on a full custom car audio build to update a past build that I did here on the channel. Let's get our new door speakers installed. So to bring you guys up to speed, in a previous video in this video build log series, I designed and printed these 3D printed speaker adapters. A few advantages of going with 3D printing are that we size perfectly to the exact drivers that we are using in our system, and I can also have better control over the total thickness of the adapter, allowing the speaker to get as close to the speaker grill in the door panel as possible without obviously making contact with it. I've also designed a hole into these which will allow for pass-through of the speaker wire, because in this particular vehicle, the speaker wire is routed in front of the speaker, and on the factory speakers, it just plugs into a plug on those factory speakers. So since it's on this side of the speaker, I obviously need to go through to the back side to connect to the speaker terminals. So I've allowed for that with the design of these adapters. We'll of course seal those holes up with some butyl rubber. We'll talk about that later in the process of our installation. For this project, we are installing these Focal flex drivers. Again, to bring you up to speed, just in case you don't know, in the back doors, we have these coaxial speakers. Coaxial meaning that it also incorporates this tweeter. And for the front stage, we have a 3-way component set. So we have a 6.5-inch woofer in each door, and then we're going to have a 3-inch mid along with a tweeter in each A-pillar. We're going to focus more on installing the speakers in this video, but I did want to mention that I do have my speaker wire on hand now, and this is from our show sponsor, New Concepts. This is the Karma cable speaker wire. Now in my application here, I have a bunch of 14 gauge, but this also comes in 8 gauge, 10 gauge, 12 gauge, 14 gauge, and 16 gauge. They also have a 12 gauge 4-conductor version, which is awesome for applications like A-pillars where you're going to have a tweeter and a mid-range, so you need those 2 separate channels of power. The Karma cable has been my go-to speaker wire for many years now, long before I ever even started the channel. If you guys want to learn more, check out the links down in the video description. Now the first step, of course, here to get access to this speaker is to remove the door panel. Now depending on the vehicle, this is going to be a different process, but I can give you guys some general tips. I recommend that you definitely have a plastic pry tool. This helps you avoid any damage on different panels as you remove them. Another good idea is once you take these panels out of the vehicle, don't throw them on the floor of your garage. Instead, get an old blanket and throw it on top of that. That way you make sure you don't scratch any of these surfaces. I've got another panel to remove here, and another one down here. This is why it's helpful to get a wide variety of different pry tools. This one has a little hook that we can use on the end. Now I have access to each of these different fasteners that I can simply remove. For fasteners, I find it's handy to make yourself a little storage box like this. I'm going to put these in the front driver door compartment. Now, a newer tool that I found handy to have for removing the door panels is this air bladder here, and I bought a couple of these online, and the first few didn't really work quite right, but I found this particular brand that I have linked for you guys down in the video description works really well because it has a rigid piece of material in here. So with that rigid material on the inside there, we can really get this into the tight crack between the metal and the plastic door panel, and we're going to use this air pump to pump this up until we get the release that just happened, and then we can push this little button here. It releases the air. This allows us to get our fingers in here and work our way around. And of course, we can also use the air bladder to work our way around if we encounter any challenging fasteners. Once all of our fasteners are released, typically on a door panel, you're going to lift up, which helps get you off of this lip here. And then there's going to be some different wire harness connections that we need to disconnect. Don't forget, before you undo any of those electrical connections, it's always a good idea to remove the negative battery terminal in the vehicle. So of course, with the door panel out of the way, this gives us access to our speaker. Now you're gonna notice that here in my application, I already have an aftermarket speaker installed. That's because I did a previous build on this video here on the channel. If you guys wanna see that full previous build in detail, definitely be sure to check that playlist out. But for now, since we are going to a different set of aftermarket speakers, I can remove these fasteners, which will allow me to remove this speaker, and I can disconnect the wiring at the factory plug right here. So obviously, again, normally that would be a stock speaker that you would be removing, but we've got it removed out of the way now. And I do want to point out something here. Something else that I already changed in that previous build is I installed this little bit of sound treatment material. One of the most important locations to sound treat is directly around the speaker, as you don't want any resonance in the material around that speaker. And you can see that I've also applied just a couple of pieces of material on the inside of the door skin there and down here on this large flat area. To give you guys a little bit of a teaser on what I plan to do additionally to this vehicle, I do intend to do a much more involved sound treatment process. Part of that process will be capping this off with a solid piece of material. Instead of this flimsy plastic, I'll be applying more of the sound treatment materials to this whole door here, but I do want to do some testing and see the difference between just this small amount of sound treatment and then doing a full sound treatment process. So for now, we're just going to be installing the speakers. And we're also going to be doing this treatment in the back of the vehicle. So stay tuned in this video if you want to see the process. On the stock speakers in the vehicle, this plug is actually a part of the speaker. So this piece here is an aftermarket piece that I had on this previous installation. I do want to steal this and transfer it over to our new adapter. Disconnect the wiring there, can push it through. I ended up having to cut the old terminals off in order to get them through that small hole there, so now we need to apply some new ones. And we will put some heat shrink over these to finish them off. I pass the connectors through our hole on the front here and then connect them at the speaker terminals on the back. I then use a small amount of butyl rubber to seal up that hole. Now, if you go back and watch my 3D printing video where I made these adapters, when I screwed the speaker into the adapters using the heat set inserts, there's actually some metal threads in there, I put a layer of foam between the speaker and the adapter just to ensure that we don't have any air leaks between that edge. Now I also want to make sure that we do not have any air leaks between the adapter and the metal surface. So for that reason, I want to take some foam tape and I also want to apply it around the back side of the outside edge of this adapter. So now that we have that added, we're going to have a nice seal. Now the final thing that we need to add here is we need a way to actually guide the sound from the driver through the speaker grill on the door panel. When the speaker is mounted into the door, there's actually a little bit of space, of course, between the speaker and the speaker grill because you wouldn't want the speaker to be hitting the grill. So in order to guide the sound through the speaker grill, we need a way to bridge that gap. On this project for that, I'm going to be using the Sound Shield Contour speaker strips. If we open up the box here, you can see that this is a kit that allows us to do 4 different speakers. So they give us 4 of these pads. You stick these inside the door panel behind the speaker, and they actually give us 6 of these different strips here. You can see that these strips are made from a foam that will easily conform and bridge the gap between our speaker and the speaker grill. There's a backing paper that we can remove here to expose the adhesive. This adhesive allows the foam to stick to the speaker. And I know what you might be thinking because it's a concern that I also had. You may be wondering, what about that adhesive sticking to my speaker? You know, if I go to swap this speaker out, I don't want to have a bunch of adhesive residue on it. But I've found in my experience that this adhesive here removes with the foam if you ever do go to peel this off. It doesn't make a sticky mess on the speaker. So much like we applied that foam tape, we're just going to carefully apply this and stick it around the outside edge. So we'll trim this right here, and you can see that this is more than enough to do a 6.5-inch 8-inch speaker. You could probably honestly do an 8-inch driver also if you were installing that into a vehicle. So in the meantime, I've installed this eggshell foam inside here and just used my wooden roller to make sure that it's good and stuck inside of the door. And now we can get our speaker and adapter assembly physically mounted into the door. Grab my screws here out of my organizational tray and let's get this mounted in place. Now when I'm reattaching fasteners here, I like to do it by hand just so I can get a feel for how much torque is on the fastener. I don't want to strip out any of these fastener thread locations. And do keep in mind that depending on the vehicle, sometimes you need to connect the speaker wiring first to the back of the speaker inside the door before you attach it. Again, in my case here, here's my plug. So let's reconnect our speaker wire plug right here. Now do keep in mind, this is an aftermarket plug that we've added here. Normally this harness would go straight into the speaker itself, so you wouldn't have to worry about it vibrating. In our case here, you can see that this could potentially vibrate up against the edge of the speaker adapter there. So I want to take some of this closed cell foam and I'm going to put it between the two different surfaces. I'm going to wrap it around this connector and I'm just going to secure it with some cloth tape. I've got some JK tape here. I'm just going to rip myself a couple of small sections and get it wrapped around. Nothing crazy, but now you can see we don't have to worry about this potentially vibrating and creating any noise issues. So here it is, my friends. Our aftermarket speaker is completely installed, and this, of course, is one of 4 out of the 4 doors that we need to do. Let's get this door panel reattached. Another important step once you do have the door panel reattached is to take a small flashlight like this, and this is going to be really hard to show on video. Maybe you guys can kind of see it there, but I like to turn off the lights in the room. You might be able to see it a little bit better if you turn off the lights in the room, but you want to make sure that there is nothing interfering with the cone of the speaker once everything is reinstalled. It's always a good idea to double check that foam and make sure that we are good to go. I think you guys can see that pretty well actually, that we are good. I've now repeated all of those same steps over here on the driver's side as well. We've got that speaker ready to go, so now we can move on to the rear doors. For the sake of time, I've removed this door panel already off of camera, and you guys can see that in this case, we do have a factory speaker here to remove. Something I want to point out really quick though, notice that the factory speaker has this foam around the speaker. That's that same foam that we're trying to replicate when we add that aftermarket foam in order to help guide the sound through the speaker grill. Also for reference, you can see how the speaker wiring adapter is built directly into the speaker. Holy cow, look at that tiny little magnet. I mean, honestly, guys, tell me, what would you rather have in your vehicle? Here's our aftermarket speaker wire harness we're going to be using. I do want to point out that only 2 of the pinned locations on this harness are actually being used, whereas the aftermarket harness is designed to use multiple if need be. I want to repin this harness just to get rid of some of this unneeded extra wiring. I'll grab one of these little tools here, and if I take this and put it in the right spot here, it releases a little tab and I can pull that out. I used a little Sharpie just to make a note on each side just so I can remember which side the white wiring, which is positive, was attached to. I've trimmed away some of the unneeded wiring, so now I just have these 2 pins to simplify this, and I'm going to reinstall it into the connector here. There we go. And there's the other. Just give it the little pull test, make sure it's good in there. So now we are good to go. We've got a simplified harness. To clean these up even more, I twist the wires and wrap them with that cloth tape to give them the same OEM level of treatment, very similar to the existing wiring in the vehicle. After I connect that wiring harness, I once again use that butyl rubber to seal up the hole in my adapter, and I do the same preparations with the foam on the front here, along with that foam on the outside perimeter of the adapter on the rear. Now, before I can reinstall our aftermarket speaker here, I do need to do some minor sound treatment around the opening here. So to do that, I'm first going to apply this thin piece of plastic tape. The reason for this is I can draw out the different mounting hole locations and I can transfer them to my piece of sound treatment material. That way I'm not doing any of the cutting on the vehicle itself and scratching any of the paint. And then what I'm going to do is use this special punch set here. I'll put a link to this down in the video description as well, but we can put a piece of wood behind this and we can punch out the different hole locations just by using a hammer. Just like that, we have a nice, perfectly clean hole location that we can use for our different fasteners. And then for some areas where we may need more of a slot type hole, what we can do is we can make 2 holes right next to each other, like this, and we can trim away that little nub if we wanted, if they were further apart. Remove our backing paper here, and you'll notice I intentionally didn't cut out the speaker hole. More on that in just a second. We can once again use our wooden roller to secure all of this in place. And the reason I didn't cut the speaker hole is I wanted to try this technique instead of cutting kind of this star shape in the middle with a knife. This way you can really work the inside edge of that material up against the edge of the speaker hole here and almost kind of wrap it around slightly, around to the back side. There's of course always multiple ways to do this. You could just draw that circle and cut it over on the cardboard like we did the rest of these different holes, but up to you to try. So here's how that looks once I've worked all that material around the inside edge, and I did trim it a little bit closer to the edge before I worked it around. And then if you look close enough on the inside of the door cavity there, I also cleaned that sheet metal and did a couple more pieces of this material along with that sound shield eggshell foam backer behind the speaker. And again, now that all this material is applied, I do want to point out how nice and clean each of these cutout holes looked because we used that punch. And I also want to point out that I added holes here for these access locations. These are intentionally covered with just this piece of tape. That's something that people commonly mention when I do apply this sound treatment material. They say, hey, what if you ever had to take anything apart? Well, if we take the time to do this right, we can make it so that everything is still serviceable. So now we can install our speaker by adding that mounting hardware. So here we have that wrapped in foam, tucked out of the way, and once again we have another speaker install complete into the rear doors of this vehicle. So with the door speakers installed, what is the next step of this project? Well, we need to get our amplifier rack that we made previously installed into the vehicle. And we're also going to need to run all of our new aftermarket wiring. We also need to get these new custom A-pillars installed. To catch those new videos, if you are new here, I'd love to have you as a subscriber. Also, don't forget next time you need wiring for a car audio build to check out our show sponsor, New Concepts, at the link down in the video description. A big thanks to them along with Jerry and the Patreon membership team for making these videos possible, and thank you guys for tuning in and watching.